millions of ex-felons across the United States can't vote. But that may soon change. Should ex-felons be allowed to vote? Welcome back to America Uncovered. I'm your host, Chris Chappell. Voting is arguably one of the most important rights afforded to Americans. People have marched and fought in order for all citizens to be allowed to vote. And before you leave a comment saying, "Okay, boomer, take your lecture somewhere else," just know that my TikTok skills are getting better by the day. Not that TikTok skills were enough to save Andrew Yang. Anyway, the fight for equal voting rights in the United States is nothing new. But today, people still rally against the disenfranchisement of marginalized groups. I'm not talking about literally everyone living in Washington, D.C. No, I'm talking about people who have survived a place with even more crooks than D.C. Prison. These are ex-felons, people who've committed felonies, served their prison time, and are back in society. And while most people see voting as being as enjoyable as wearing a wool tuxedo to a pool party, it's actually a fundamental right that people shouldn't take for granted. An estimated 25 million Americans have been convicted of a felony, and about 6 million Americans, or 1 in every 40 adults, have currently or permanently lost their voting rights as a result of that conviction. That means 1 in 40 adult Americans weren't able to vote in the 2016 presidential election. And even though you might not have wanted to vote for any presidential candidate in 2016, voting is about a lot more than that. For example, you can also vote for congresspeople you don't like. So what exactly is the right to vote? It turns out the original U.S. Constitution doesn't say anything about it. That only came with the 15th Amendment in 1860. It said the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, which meant slavery. So the good news is now you could vote even if you had once been a slave, as long as you were a male slave. Until the 19th Amendment in 1920 allowed women to vote too, unless you were a black male or female in a state with Jim Crow laws. Then you still couldn't vote until an entire civil rights movement and the 24th Amendment passed in 1964. And then, of course, the 26th Amendment in 1971 lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. America, where we trust 18-year-olds to vote, but not to drink alcohol. Which is good, because what if all the 18-year-olds got drunk and voted for Vermin Supreme, who is an actual candidate, who's promising Americans actual ponies? Way to lock up the youth vote. But back to those amendments. Did you notice how they use language like the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged on account of blank? Well, even in 2020, that still leaves some room for individual states to decide who does or doesn't get to vote, especially when it comes to people convicted of felonies. But first, let's go back to 1974, when the Supreme Court made a landmark ruling on the 14th Amendment. Fun fact, the Supreme Court during that period was called the Burger Court, because it was overseen by Chief Justice Warren E. Burger, not to be confused with other trailblazing titans of the law like Chief Justice Mac and Cheese. Anyway, the 14th Amendment was originally passed to grant citizenship to former slaves. But it also says, among other things, that all citizens have equal protection under the law. It's been used in landmark cases like Roe v. Wade and Brown v. Board of Education. But the Burger Court ruled in 1974 that the amendment gives states the power to disenfranchise convicted criminals as they see fit, at least as long as they don't discriminate based on race or gender. And so different states do different things. In Maine and Vermont, for instance, felons never lose their right to vote even while they're in prison. That's uncommon, though. On the other hand, Iowa is the only state that permanently takes away the right to vote from felons. Most states now will restore voting rights as long as certain conditions are met. Those conditions might include completing parole or filling out an application or going before a panel and pleading your case. And there's no state that has an abundance of both felons and weird laws like Florida. No, I'm obviously talking about this Florida. Thank you. This Florida man, incidentally, was arrested for climbing to the top of playground equipment and telling children in colorful language where babies come from. He was charged with disorderly conduct, but that's not a felony. He can still vote. What is a felony is robbery with a deadly weapon. That's what Florida man Melvin Blackshear was convicted of in 1975 when he was in his 20s. He served his time and he's been out of prison for years, but he could not vote in Florida because of his previous felony conviction. Then, in the 2018 midterm elections, Florida held a referendum and passed a constitutional amendment called Amendment 4 to restore voting rights for Melvin Blackshear and about 1.4 million other former felons. That's basically all former felons who didn't commit murder or sex crimes.
There'll be a day that I really feel good. I really feel like a citizen, not just a person, a Floridian, but I would feel like an American.
Well, he might not want to get too excited just yet. After Florida voters passed Amendment 4, the Florida government tried to make it more difficult for felons to vote. In 2019, the governor signed a bill that required people with felony records to pay all fines and fees associated with their sentence prior to the restoration of their voting rights. That deliberately undercut the outcome voters intended to secure. Well, it only affects ex-felons who don't have a lot of money, but of course it's much harder for ex-felons to find work and earn money. The average amount of fines and fees a convicted defendant pays in Florida is $923. That's equivalent to 60 hours of wages at $15 an hour. And some might value or need the money more than the right to vote. Either way, it is a barrier. Should there be barriers to ex-felons voting? Well, that's where the debate is. As I said earlier, over the past several decades, most states have allowed voting rights to be restored as long as certain conditions are met. Some feel that should go further, that there should be no government conditions, and that voting rights will help ex-felons become fully functioning members of society again. Others feel like once you've committed a felony, you've shown a certain lack of judgment and moral quality that means certain rights should get permanently revoked. After all, ex-felons aren't allowed to buy guns. Should they be allowed to buy guns so they can feel more like part of society? Then there's the problem of recidivism. That is someone relapsing back into criminal behavior. A 2018 report from the U.S. Justice Department found that a shocking 68% of released prisoners were arrested again within 3 years, and 83% within 9 years. That applies to all prisoners, not just felons. There's also concern about how this new demographic of ex-felon voters might be used to swing elections. This theory is based on the fact that people who go to prison are more likely to vote for Democrats. Blacks and Hispanics make up a disproportionate number of prisoners. And in general, Hispanics tend to vote for Democrats by a 2-to-1 margin. African Americans tend to vote for Democrats roughly 9-to-1, Kanye West being the one. According to a 2002 study, Democrats would have received about 7 out of every 10 votes by felons in previously researched elections. That's pretty significant when you consider swing states like Florida, which can make or break an election. If ex-felons in Florida had been able to vote in the 2000 election, it could have changed the course of history forever. I mean, Al Gore invented the internet. Imagine what he could have invented as president. So with ex-felons voting for Democrats the majority of the time, this would seem like a win for the Democratic Party. But here's an interesting fact. In Florida, before the latest Amendment 4, the governor would have to approve each ex-felon to get their voting rights back. The ex-felon would have to prove to the government that they were fully reformed, functioning members of society. The previous 3 governors, all elected as Republicans, restored voting rights for more than 200,000 people who did this. Which is to say, several Republican governors restored voting rights even though statistically it was against the interests of the Republican Party. Also, wow, Florida has a lot of ex-felons. So what do you think about ex-felons' voting rights? And is Burger Court a good nickname for the highest court of the land? Leave your comments below. And remember, America Uncovered is supported mainly through viewers like you. We rely on you to share this content with your friends to get the word out there on important and complicated topics like this one. Contribute $1 or more per episode on our Patreon page so that we can continue making content like this. Once again, I'm your host, Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching America Uncovered.